know what their college life is going to look like next year.
Yeah, I think those are all good concerns and common concerns. I've heard a lot of teachers voicing those concerns. And Cody, we've kind of talked a little bit about this over social media. And it's especially tough. Now, first of all, this shift is by necessity, of course, right? Like I've heard some say, well, it's so sudden, this shift in policy. Well, it's sudden because of necessity. And in fact, there's been some criticism that, our district, other districts have waited too long to create a grading policy. Others say they should have waited longer, so things like that. And at the same time, I was looking into New York City schools, so biggest school district in the nation. They haven't yet made their policy. Looks like, I'm guessing they're coming close. But so the suddenness is by necessity. Ideally, we would all be preparing for this, for students to be motivated beyond grades. But, reality is, unfortunately, and this gets back to, what we've been talking about at least all year, if not more than that, is way too often grades are used for the wrong purposes. Grades are, hey, Yvette figured out how to raise the hand. Yvette, maybe you can share with us how to do that. But grades have been used for carrots and sticks where they're not meant to do that. Now, that doesn't solve things for right now. Just saying, well, see, that we're supposed to do it in that way. But I think that is a reality. One of the big things, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, so I won't get too much into it, but I think one of the keys right now is to really hone in on intrinsic motivation. And it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything. But I mean, that's what we want to do with grades anyway. If we really want to, going back to that definition, the purpose of grades is to communicate student learning. That's it. That's it. We want to take out that extrinsic motivation as much as possible, even though we know it's going to be a natural part. But, I think the biggest thing is to try to get to that intrinsic motivation. Maybe we can do one more question for now, and then I'll get through the rest of a couple more sentences for the policy and then pause again. Yvette, I saw the hand. I don't see your face right now.
I'm there. I'm just kind of on the side there. I just wanted to say when Cody was talking about this and this idea of getting students motivated, because we started this process at the beginning of the semester, my class has already had more of that we're learning, not getting a grade kind of thing. So even after this policy came out with my juniors, who probably all but 3 would get a pass, no pass based on third quarter grade, I had students resubmit. I had one student yesterday resubmit 5 assignments. So this idea of changing the perspective around grades, I'm seeing actually work really well in class. It was an experiment this year. We were piloting it, and now this sort of crisis has let us see whether or not it's functioning. And I'm seeing really positive results from my students. I know it's late for some people who didn't start this at the beginning, but I just wanted to reiterate that this process has actually had a great effect on students thinking about learning as opposed to grades.
Great point. I'm seeing some of similar things. And again, that's another silver lining that I'm seeing, that this is kind of supports that work that we've done. Although, there are still ongoing issues for sure. Okay, so a couple more things here as far as statements from the policy. So it goes on to say, I'm asking every teacher to contact all students who failed a third quarter class in order to develop a personalized plan for the student to review and learn the course's academic content in order to receive a deserved passing grade. So really what I see this is, I'm interpreting this to mean that we need to, more than ever again, prioritize differentiation, right? This is like pretty much mandatory in the best sense of the word, differentiation. And we are prioritizing those kids who are not passing at this time, that have the no pass. And, some people, that's going to be tougher than others. And again, get more into this a little bit later. Like Yvette had mentioned, one of the benefits I think of grading reform from this year and previous years, but especially this year, is because our AP, our assistant principals just sent out lists to all teachers about how many kids were failing. And so meaning like she was basically addressing this here, we have to take care of this. And, luckily my list is pretty low in a large part, I think, because of the grading reform. But again, people are all over the place with that, of course. And so focusing on the academic content, of course, which is good, is relearning those things and bumping up their grade. But again, we want the grade really to mean that learning, not just okay, well, here's some worksheets to fill out, and now you're passing. So I think we just have to be careful with that. Okay, well, that was the last statement. Actually, there was more to the letter, but that was the last of the key statements, I thought. And so other thoughts or questions, concerns about the policy itself before we get to implications?
One thing I've noticed is that teachers that are having a harder time with this are ones that have the multiple categories to their grading system, are grading students on behavior and whether or not an assignment's late, and those teachers are falling apart. And the teachers that are more looking at have you learned the material are coping a little bit better. I didn't have a rough transition with this because of the grading, the standards-based grading this year.
As participants.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I like one of the first things that I would say, like right away, like if this hasn't been done by some teachers, is you immediately need to stop grading late work or not penalizing for late work. Like that needs to be immediate, like yesterday or 10 years ago or whatever, that's just an immediate thing. But yeah, Laura, I would agree with you. And that kind of goes back to the whole, grading reform has helped to prepare us for this kind of a situation.
I totally agree with Laura. My math department is completely and utterly freaking out, beyond stressed out because, oh, it's late. They didn't turn it on Tuesday. I told them the assignment was due Tuesday. It's now Thursday. I am one of 10, so I don't say much. I just sit back and relax and tell them. And when my kids say, can I turn it in? I'm like, of course you can. Just turn your work in whenever. Yeah, so I have appreciated this group tremendously for that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think again, I keep saying now more than ever, but the time and the relative nature of time, like really right now, what's going on in our country. I don't know if we're talking about like a matter of minutes, hours, even days or whatever, but does it really matter? Kids, their sleep cycles have changed so much. What they have to do at home has changed so much. What's going on in their lives. Why not allow them now to figure out what to hopefully they should be creating a schedule that works for them. And I've tried to give kids some suggestions that have been struggling of let's figure out a schedule. But hey, if they learn better at night, then why not? If they have certain times that they have to get things done, and then they can work or certain classes on certain days, and that kind of makes sense. That kind of makes sense. I know, like when I get really focused on something, I want to keep going with that. So if they're like all day on one subject and maybe they do English later in the week, hey, I'm completely fine with that. But what does that have to do with the timeliness? What does that have to do with the learning exactly? So I think we need to separate those two things. And that's, again, taking those behaviors out of the grades and the whole thing that we've been, of course, I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is some mandatory grading reforms for teachers who don't necessarily want to do that, but we have to because it's about equity.
Josh?
Yeah.
Okay, just kind of an observation. So, I mean,
sounds
number
like
one,
Cody, right? I'm not seeing your face, but it sounds.
Oh yeah, Cody. Hey. This is great conversations that you guys have been having all semester, but these are conversations that really haven't bled into. At least on my campus, I know in your department and what you've been doing at Highland has been great. But it's interesting, and I had posted on the comments that it seems like that just the status quo has always been, do the work, get the grade, you're a good student. And so that's been kind of the mechanism that runs school. That's the language that people speak on all levels, be it from student to teacher to counselor to administrator. that it's all there to kind of maintain that. And then, I mean, what you guys are doing is like really punk rock, but I mean, in that it's underground and you know, and it's great and hopefully affects change. But have you guys been talking about maybe some like transitional kind of intermediary actions that might take people from, you know, what that initial paradigm and get them to transition? I mean, you think about like Machiavelli, you know, where you go from the Florence Republic all the way to the Medici, autocracy or kleptocracy, and that by that prince that he wrote is kind of that transition piece back away from a despotic system back into a republic. I mean, what is this group's prince in terms of finding a transitional piece that allow people to go from traditional grade practices to reform grading? Yeah.
That's some great question, Cody. And I think primarily what we've been trying to do is, I mean, it's kind of as you've implied, grassroots kind of an effort, you know. But we have this is district resources that we have for this small group, and you know, it's tricky because we have a long history in our country, over 100 years of grading autonomy, and I think lots of times teachers feel, I think the harsh reality is teachers feel like grading is it's like, don't take away my guns and don't take away my grades, because, you know, if you try to, then, you know, we'll see what happens. It's like a God-given right almost. And, you know, it's not, because grades are just about communicating and learning. So because of the emotions that are so ingrained in grading, because of that, because not to get too much into this, but I think it's a good question. And just because I think lots of times, just again, the reality is parents, students, most teachers don't see grading as a problem. So if they don't see grading as a problem, then it doesn't need a fix, right? It's not a fire. It doesn't need to be put out. So why bring up the topic when, see here, what happened, you know, by necessity when we change grading policy? Like, people are across the country, like some teachers are going nuts, but we had to do it, right? So just bring it up. It's hard to do, and it's hard, I think, to get it on the agenda. But I think it's on the agenda now more than ever. It just had been. There's more and more books every year that are being published on grading, and now because of what's happened. So I think it is something that's on the agenda. We're hoping to get another cohort for next year. These have been some people from across the district and a little bit across subject areas, mostly English teachers. We have some math teachers as well. And so I think for now, we want to go about it in that way, but because I think we also have to be careful. Nobody wants top-down grading mandates, right? Either, you know, at the same time, even if it's in the best interest of our students, which, you know, depending on the policy, a lot of the reforms are. So I don't know. I hope I answered your question, kind of. But I think it's tough to get on the agenda. It's tough to get people to even think about or care about it when they don't fix something that's not broke.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, so maybe step one in this is raising the awareness, like you said, and kind of spelling out like, hey, wait a minute, this is an issue in terms of like, if we're going to focus on student learning, student engagement, critical thinking, also SEL practices in terms of just, you know, as grades have become more of a trigger of student anxiety, where they feel less in control of their learning. That I think that the discursive structure has really been established to allow this sort of new talking point to enter into the discourse. Yeah,
I agree. Let's take grades out of the game of school. When we can separate grades from behavior, then we can address behavior as behavior and not cover it up with grading practices that do not fully address the issue. You know, we can use things such as restorative practices, SEL practices, so on and so forth, to really address those behaviors and not just cover it up with grades. So hopefully we'll get some more attention. Again, silver lining, really.
Cool.
Oh, I'm sorry. Were there anybody else have a big question to answer before we get to teaching and learning implications?
There aren't any in the chat, Josh, but there's a lot of really good points. So if you guys haven't checked out the chat, people are really making some excellent points in there.
Great. I'm looking forward to reading through that later for sure. So teaching and learning implications. We've already brought up some of these, but I'd like to go a little bit more in depth. So Cody, this is a good transition, I think. I just put this figure together yesterday, and so it's, you know, nothing that's too sophisticated really, but I hope the idea kind of gets, the bigger point kind of takes hold. So again, my concern has been, one of my primary concerns for teachers, initial reactions when they're saying, okay, grades, like pretty much grades are out of the picture for fourth quarter, therefore no more learning, no more teaching, we're just done. And so to that I say, well, hold on a second. Why, whenever has student learning been so dependent on grades that it doesn't happen without grading? Student learning is not dependent on grading, right? We can completely continue school and students can learn without grades. Now, where we would have some issues is about communication about that, but we can definitely do that without letters, right? We can communicate. We're communicating right now without letters. You know, we can do that. Descriptive feedback, that's what I mean by that. So we can go on without grades, and we need to go on without grades. So what this is supposed to represent is we have student learning there in the middle, of course, in orange there, and feedback is a really big part of student learning. And feedback has to continue during distance learning, right? Because if we take feedback out, then student learning is severely reduced. So like, we need to put lots of effort into feedback right now, even though there's challenges with communication, but there's lots of great technologies that allow that. Some teachers are really good at that. Some are relearning, some are learning anew, but feedback is a huge part. Assessment is still a part too. Assessment is still an important part. We know, of course, assessment we're talking about in terms of both formative and summative, and primarily we're talking about formative assessment because we want, if that's assessment for learning, we're gathering information of where students are currently at so we can give them feedback about their current learning progression, where they're at, how they can go forward, and also we take that information about student progress, and it's feedback for us as we adjust our our teaching practices. And so these are really big, important parts too. We still need summative assessment because eventually, hopefully fourth quarter, kids are going to come to the end of a learning progression, and we need to figure when they're at the end. So yeah, we still need summative assessment even though we're not grading. That's, again, those don't have to be linked all the time, grading and summative assessment. We can use descriptive feedback there besides grades. So those are important parts. That's what this is supposed to show. And then lastly, we can take out grading and learning continues, like I said. And of course, in the gray there's some stuff that happens. So those circles that are outside of the learning part, you know, that don't necessarily have anything to do with learning. And lots of times, unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff from grading that has nothing to do with learning. It's not just communicating student learning, but, you know, those behaviors and effort and participation, and they may be correlations, but they're not the same thing as student learning. And that's all that's supposed to show, again, because I have a really big concern that some teachers thinking, okay, no more learning, no more teaching. And then one more concept I just want to throw out there too, about this idea. I've been really thinking a lot about summer learning loss, and something I know lots of people here are familiar with, and there's lots of research that documents it. So summer learning loss and implications for school closures. So lots of research shows that students' achievement scores decline over summer vacation by 1 month's worth of school year learning. So traditionally, you know, kids are out for 2 months, and they lose on average about 1 month's worth of school learning. By the way, this information comes from a review of literature from Quinn and Polikoff, 2017, and this is from the Brookings Institute report, but they reviewed lots of literature. The extent of loss is larger at higher grade levels, so we're talking about high school, and then also the income-based reading gaps grow over the summer. So, so really, the big idea is that the achievement gap, it gets bigger over the summer. All right, so that's over 2 months. Over 2 months, you know, students are losing like a month worth of learning. Okay, well now we have to multiply that, right? So we're looking, kids are missing about 5 months of school. So if we said, okay, they're going to lose about half of that, 2.5 months, that's a quarter. They're losing potentially a quarter of learning. Now, again, these are just like rough estimates, but the point is that we have to be really keeping this in mind. Now, that's not all kids, right? We know that kids in poverty are hardest hit. We know that some kids at home, they can maintain, they can kind of tread water. And there are some kids who can continue learning above and beyond, but those are the ones who are most lucky. But these are some things that we really need to be thinking about. And so really trying to minimize the increase of that gap and to try to continue learning here. And it should be one of our big focal points. So with that, again, getting back to the grading policy from the district, essential differentiation. So this gets into like when we're thinking about curriculum maps and stuff like that. And so my suggestion is, if you haven't already done with your learning team, to reprioritize those essential standards, those priority standards for third quarter, to go back if you haven't done that, maybe as well as could have been done. And then also for fourth quarter, what we've already gone into, and then finishing up the year. That reprioritization is really key, I think, for that differentiation. And so I have a little bit of color coding I'm going to get to in a couple slides here in the future. And so my suggestion when you're thinking about which standards to prioritize. So again, we are in a very challenging situation. And so we want to choose only those standards that are absolutely crucial for kids. We know we do not have the luxury of just saying, well, they're all important, or even most of them are important, right? If we want to prioritize we want to prioritize in the best of times. Unfortunately, we are not living in the best of times right now. So we have to go down to bare bones, what is most essential, and really focus on that to make it manageable for kids to learn. So what's most essential for this year? What's most essential for next year, for their learning next year to be successful? What's most essential for them to be successful post high school, whether it's college, career, so on and so forth. And what's most essential for their life too, right? And I think getting to that, by the way, because I don't think we should rush and just look over and say, oh yeah, of course, but getting to that helps us to get back into the intrinsic motivation, right? If we can effectively communicate this, the reason why we've chosen these standards, this can help to better motivate kids to learn when grades are taken out of the picture. So really what I think, again, this essential differentiation, I see this as essentially two different learning routes, and that's the enrichment and the remediation route. So the remediation route really needs to be the priority, of course, right? Those are the kids who had an F from third quarter, but I added the D in there too. This is for me, and this is what I suggest as well. This is not district policy, but for me, I know, so on my rubrics, the translation of D is beginning. And beginning level skills of essential priority standards, that's not okay to do well next year, and that's not okay for them to do well, in college. And so I will be targeting kids who have Fs and Ds as well, and for remediation. And when I say remediation of these third quarter priority standards, so I have about 6 priority standards from third quarter that I will be prioritizing for kids. Now, not all kids, because some kids who have a D, they might have done well on one assessment, but not on another one, right? Or on one, let's say one standard on assessment, but not on the other 2 standards on that same assessment. So really that differentiation is really key, but I think that's the priority here. And then the second route, again, is enrichment. So those kids who have received a pass already, and the enrichment is, I think this is a strange way of thinking about it, but everything kids would normally be learning during fourth quarter, that's enrichment, that's above and beyond. Now, unfortunately, the above and beyond this year is like trying to catch up to what was the norm in previous years. But this is the way that I'm looking at it, the two different learning routes, to try to guide the differentiation for myself, for my learning team, and then for my students too. So for the remediation, some keys I think is intensive communication efforts. I know for myself, one of the biggest challenges for distance learning is the communication. Something that you could quickly explain to a kid, just in a second, for if they had a quick question, they have to take the time to email or to communicate in some other way, and you have to respond, and so on and so forth. But intensive communication efforts, starting with email, but phone calls and everything we need to do. And I think this is above and beyond just like that gratuitous phone call we might give before sending a kid to the dean's office. Like, this is really important. It's like a must to make communication. And for some kids, of course, it's tougher than others, but I think that's a key to start with. Of course, prioritize grace and understanding, because the kids who are in this route, I have a feeling that a good number of those kids, those are the kids who are the bottom of Maslow's, the hierarchy of needs. That is not being addressed. So these kids need the most grace and understanding, I think. And but they also need authentic practice to further learn previous standards in teaching. So it's not just a signing of worksheets, but it's real teaching that goes on, which means lots of timely, specific feedback and reassessment opportunities with no penalties, of course, right? If anybody had penalties in the past for retakes, which I don't think is ever a good idea, if ever, now is the time to get rid of those things, which are really, if we're going to be honest, those are pretty antiquated, right? Let's just take the power of points out of the equation. And then the enrichment. So we're continuing the prioritized fourth quarter standards and providing regular learning tasks, instructional resources, as best as possible. But the key here is, and again, I know for some people say, well, yeah, of course, but the key here is that the teaching continues. And, I think we're kind of all over the place because this is new for everybody, but I get really concerned when I hear teachers questioning if teaching continues. Well, in my view, teachers teach. And if we're not teaching, then what are we doing? Even though we're in a difficult situation here. So regular learning tasks, instructional resources, frequent formative assessments, summative as necessary, timely, specific feedback. Any thoughts or about these different learning routes before I just get to a couple other things here with intrinsic motivation? That might be some questions or concerns about the motivation.
How have your D students been responding to this, to your reaching out to them about shoring up those skills that they were deficient in?
Sounds like Casey. I'm not seeing a face, but sounds like Casey.
Yep. Casey.
Yeah, so Casey, I am at the early stages of doing this actually. So then we are, as a learning team, we are modifying our curriculum into these two routes. Actually, hopefully we'll be finishing up today. And so I am at the very early stages of doing this. And I am, I guess, in a sense, kind of lucky that with grading reform this year, I don't have a lot of kids who are in the D range either, but there's definitely more kids in the D range than in the F range. So I don't feel like I have really an accurate or clear answer for you just because it's not fully developed yet. So, okay, intrinsic motivation here. So I think let's get to the big question of, so why should kids do the work, right? Why should they continue learning if there's no grade, right? Because kids, like some kids knew about this before we even knew about this, right? Especially AP kids. I've been getting lots of emails before I put out a clarifying video about this, about it. So it's helped me, as I've been thinking about this, to revisit a really good book that if you haven't read, I would suggest. It's called Drive by Daniel Pink. And the subtitle is The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. I believe it was published in 2009. And he primarily targets business people, but the things that apply to business also apply to education. And he does explicitly address education multiple times in the book. He even has, I believe, like a chapter or some kind of a small chapter at the end that is specific for education. And so he talks about really 3 essential parts of intrinsic motivation: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I think this is where we need to go, or continue to go and focus on with our students who don't have those grades as carrots and sticks, right? Who don't have grades as extrinsic motivation. So he talks about autonomy means autonomy of task. They get a choice of what they're doing. So translated to school, what is the learning activity? Or maybe what is the article that they read? Or in math, maybe which problems that they answer, as long as, I'm sorry, math people, because I'm not a math teacher, but as long as they're at a similar level of difficulty, right? Time, we've talked about time already, but we want to give them some time. We want to give them what time of day, how many days. We don't want to be punishing them for those behaviors, really. If it's a group project, probably fewer group projects that are going on right now in distance learning, but if it is, then they get to choose the team that they're in. We have to be careful if they are group projects that, if we're assessing them, that it really is the individual student, not the whole group. And then the technique as well. So if we're focusing on results, then he talks a lot about, if the focus is on results, then, if we can allow the student, in this case, the autonomy of how they go about this, the technique, that can provide some motivation. Mastery, so they get a sense that they are moving along the learning progression. They are making progress, and feedback is really a huge part. Feedback, again, needs to be specific, though, not just good job, bad job, but very specific to where they're at. Rubrics can help. Clarity of learning tasks, rubrics can help with that. Timely feedback is especially important. And then finally, purpose. Getting back to the standards I said, being very careful about choosing those standards, but if they can really understand the importance of standards to them as a person, as a learner, as a student, and also those learning tasks, to understand why these tasks are important for them. These things are not easy to do. They're not easy to communicate. It's especially difficult, I think, right now if the classroom was run in a more traditional manner prior to closures, and now trying to transition, trying to shift. It's especially tough, of course. But this is what we want really for education at any time. And I think that's what's happening. I think that's what a lot of teachers are recognizing. Like, this is good practice anytime. Now we're just forced to do it, So these are some thoughts about addressing intrinsic motivation. And I'll pause here. Cody, I saw that you found the raise hand button.
I did. I finally found that years later. So one of the things, and I don't remember Pink talking about this explicitly, but it's kind of, at least in the subtext, is at least with autonomy, is agency and choice, and that kind of creates. And but what's interesting, that at least within the educational infrastructure that we have here, that it's compulsory, and it's very much characteristic of the educational experience now, is that choice is something that students really don't have. And I'm just interested in seeing right now, with kind of how things are different, like how choice can come into play in terms of replacing that engine of student motivation of grades with, giving student that sort of agency.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just address that a little bit, and maybe somebody else has some best practices as well to share. As an English teacher, a lot of us here are English teachers. I think one of the most important ways to bring in choice is in reading. And so, especially now, I'm just going to come out and say it. I think it's borderline criminal to assign class. I'm probably offending somebody, so I apologize. But to assign classic literature right now to kids at home, right, where we know that they struggle enough in class with it, to assign Shakespeare at home. We have no obligation, absolutely none, to continue on the regular learning trajectory, the learning maps that we created in this kind of utopian idea last summer, right? Where like every learning happens perfectly, and then everybody is smiling and as they're reading sonnets and stuff like that in perfect harmony. Well, that's not the reality at all, and that's hyperbole, of course. But so choice for reading especially, and I think that's a key. I think in writing there's a lot of opportunities too, and so I have a lot of my students are doing narrative writing right now, and I've gone along with some of the recommendations and what Kelly Gallagher is doing along with Penny Kittle in their classrooms. And I like the narrative writing because it's about their lives, and naturally narrative writing has lots to do about choice and about things that are relevant to them. So those are a couple things that come to mind for me. Yvette?
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute and I couldn't find my cursor. I agree with that idea about narrative, and I think it takes us back to the beginning of your conversation, Josh, about their personal experiences right now. I started this distance learning with the narrative unit, and I did one of Gallagher's assignments, A Hard Moment. And just reading what my students were saying, and it's an assignment I want to do at the beginning of the semester next year, because I learned about students who had parents in prison and who had been deported, but that was one of the assignments that I got the most participation in, because it was an opportunity for them to tell me something about themselves. So the narrative unit to start this distance learning with was a great unit for me, because it got them going. And now we're in argument, and they're continuing to go.
Great. Thanks for sharing. Any other thoughts before we wrap things up here? Okay, so so a third implication then from this new grading policy, and I think one of the things too that I think is implied throughout what I'm talking about here is the implications of the grading. You know, we're talking about grading policy, and learning is so much more. School is so much more than grades, although we get hung up on it. But it's high leverage, right? So when we take out grades, we have to think about so many other things that we use grades as a crutch for. And I think we should just really be mindful about that. Like, what are all the other, and we're not even face-to-face with kids, right? Like, imagine if we were all face-to-face with kids and we just took out grades, right? Like, imagine how crazy teachers would go with, well, what do I do when a kid walks in late? Or what do I do when they're not smiling at me or something? So I think there's just lots of implications that we should be thinking about that grades are addressing, that should be addressing. And I'm not trying to really badmouth teachers, because I've learned from many mistakes, of course. And I think it's unfortunate that teachers have to it's really trial by fire in learning about grading practices. And coming back to the point that that Cody made before is, you know, it really is time that we bring this to larger scale, that we bring this to the stage and get more teachers to be actively involved. And I think a big part of that too, though, is bringing this into teacher preparation programs. Like, why I would have loved to have a grading, maybe it wasn't even a grading class, but grading and assessment, right? Grading assessment feedback would have been awesome as a class. And I think actually that should be like a mandatory class, but that's kind of a different topic. So thinking about summer learning loss and school closure learning loss, really, right? So we have this extended period of time of 5 months, where ideally it's not 5 months, you know, it's not all of our kids who aren't learning for 5 months, of course, right? But some of our kids, there will be no learning for 5 months, and that's scary. But I think one of the biggest things that we can do is to get kids reading a lot. And now that we have, maybe we could say some flexibility on what we're asking kids to do, and we're trying to give them choice. So I brought up the idea of, and this is not, you all know that, you know, giving kids choice for reading is important, but getting them to read now, again, maybe more important than ever, and then continue throughout the summer. So I think, and also rethinking the timelines, right? So why should this this stop? Why should the learning stop at the end of the school year? No, we're not even face to face here. What makes it have to stop? Why not continue? Why not continue to have things on Google Classroom for kids, right? For learning over the school year, reading amongst other things. Now, some kids will be attending summer school. Summer school is a whole nother thing, and we all know that, right? And, you know, summer is tough on multiple fronts. How much learning goes on in summer? That's a big question, but I think we should reconsider timelines because of summer learning loss, because of the 5 months again of learning loss. So here's just a couple things about independent reading that you all know, I'm sure. Lots of research about benefits, knowledge, cultural literacy, vocabulary, standardized test scores, fluency, etc. But this is something that's just really easy to ask kids to do. Now, to get them to follow through, well, we got to get to that intrinsic motivation again. But I think it's key for both learning routes, not only for kids who got A's, B's, and C's, right, but also for those kids who are remediating. Lots of free books right now, lots of ebooks. Our schools have lots of free books, local libraries, free ebooks, Audible, if you haven't already heard, free audio books right now for kids. So lots of opportunities for that. And some kids have more time than ever. Not all, because we know that some kids are really, they have to take care of, I've heard from lots of kids, you know, that they got to take care of cousins, and they have to do this and that because, you know, mom or dad are trying to make money during this time, whatever. But some kids do have more time than ever. And we all know too that reading is a great way to escape. And sometimes we need to escape. And so we can hook kids now on reading. And that's what I'm saying. Like, let's get them hooked and let's continue that to try to minimize some of that summer learning loss, because there's so much learning loss that's going on right now. And the reality, to make up a quarter, how do you make up a quarter of learning loss? That takes years, right? Like, we got to be thinking about these implications. This is going to take years to make up. And we need to really be thinking ahead right now about how we're going to address this. Timelines reading, I think, can start. Flipgrid, I think, is, if you haven't used that, I wanted to start a long time ago. I just recently started, and it's so intuitive. I wish I would have started a long time ago. Again, intrinsic motivation about it. Cody, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this. One of the things we also may want to consider when we come back is what's interesting is, like, you brought up how, like, you know, learning stops in the summer, and this whole idea of this compartmentalization of learning. We were thinking in terms of the temporal, but also the spatial, that now that the students are no longer in the classroom, we need to get them to start rethinking that learning can happen outside of the classroom, which I think really kind of falls in where they're at right now. We are in a post-industrialized service-based economy where the students value experience as opposed to product. When we were in school, where it's all industrialized, school is still in an industrialized infrastructure, which is built like a factory. And so the only way to get the students to be able to function in that factory, to be motivated, is that we have to use, you know, draconian measures of grading, or you are, you know, ineligible for a sport that you chose to do. So maybe now we should start reconsidering, like, how we can finally be ushered into the 90s, you know, or the early aughts, in terms of what actually motivates students, and it's experience. And, you know, this whole, what's been going on now with quarantine might allow us to be able to find some new tools to make learning experiential as opposed to product-based. So I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, I think those are some great points. And again, this is a learning experience for everybody. And I know I've learned just a ton. I wish it was under better circumstances, but I just learned a ton myself. Is whether it's about psychology of teachers and students, or it's about, you know, so motivation, the psychology, whether it's about technology that I had been putting off learning for a while, and I had to. So I think we need to really get the most out of this. Like, so I think we have an obligation to get the most out of this, right? Like this, we had no choice about this, getting into this, but we need to make the most out of it. And there's a lot to be gotten out of it for sure. Okay, so those were those three major implications that I had. So if we could have some more dialogue, and so maybe we can kind of just combine these two things: dialogue, questions, comments, concerns about that, and or best practices. What you've been using recently that has been working that maybe we could learn from too?
Well, this idea of choice for my math classes, and I can't tell you how it's worked because it's due today. But I made a choice board, and there were 9 activities that supported the learning targets. And in 2 weeks, they needed to choose 5 different activities to complete of their choice that would show that they were able to either master or work with whatever that particular learning target was. So technically it's due today. So I can't really tell you any great feedback on whether the kids loved it or not, but I think that idea of choice was there and I allowed them. And I also differentiated the activities. So some were very, very entry level, basic. We're doing ratios and proportions. So very basic ratio and proportions, where others, allowed the kids that, maybe wanted to challenge themselves or have that higher level thinking, those options were there too. So hopefully it worked.
Great. Yeah, I like that idea of the choice board. That's great. Reminds me of the idea of like similar idea, a menu option. Kids get to choose, for different standards, this, and this, and just a different metaphor, really. Other best practices, questions, comments, concerns?
It's Yvette here. Just wanted to throw out, I was looking at Laura's idea in the chat, and if any of you are interested, there's a great documentary called What Schools Could Be that follows a school in San Diego called High Tech High, which does that format of personalized learning where students move throughout the school. They don't just go from one class to the other to the other. The guy also wrote a book where he traveled across the US and visited high schools and looked at best practices. It's called What School Could Be, and the name of the author is escaping me right now, but when I find it, actually I'll pull it up on Amazon and post it here in chat for you guys.
Great. What School Could Be?
Yes, What School Could Be.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions or best practices? Really anxious to read those comments. Okay, well, if there are any other, is that a hand?
Yeah, I have my hand up.
Okay, yeah, Cody.
I'm sorry. I'm like totally fueled by caffeine right now. And this is great. I love the energy. Like tiger blood flowing through me. I'm winning. So what's going on? One of the things that I think we may want to consider, and just like keeping it really simple, is thinking about the assignments and kind of what sort of feedback they intrinsically provoke.
Yeah.
And so, the hill I'll die on is just writing. Is the written word provokes qualitative feedback because it is so hard to square the circle of making writing quantitative. It actually, it stops being writing. It's like you crush a flower, and when you do that. So maybe, this is something that we should, consider in future. Is just how can we really prop up writing as a means of a primary assessment for students, and how we give feedback to that. So.
Yeah, that's a great idea. One of the things, speaking of feedback and writing feedback, that I've been struggling with to give timely feedback, timely, detailed feedback with my kids. To do it often, to do it thoroughly, even opening up Google Docs, and that's a lot of clicking just to open up each doc, and use some tech some better than others. Alice Keeler has some good tips, a lot of good tips about Google resources, but I've been trying to figure out a more effective way of giving timely feedback for writing that's still detailed, and it's still thorough and not surface level. I don't know if anybody's had any success in doing that over, with technology. Timely really thorough feedback. Maybe those things don't go together.
But I mean, honestly, Josh, I mean, I hear you. I mean, I think one of the things is just getting the students to write and then kind of being, just attacking the writing in different ways, looking at holistically, you have, the rubric thing, looking at maybe particular aspects of it. And that's what you focus on. I mean, stuff we've been talking about a long time ago with writing and how we get feedback is that we don't have to, bleed all over it every time, maybe just looking at it as, ultimately writing is just dialogue. It's students communicating their ideas in such a way that other people can engage with it. So just treating it like a dialogue and responding to it accordingly. Focusing on clarity of ideas. I don't know. I mean, we tend to, especially in ELA, we get kind of trapped in the minutia of feedback we need to find every comma splice and every misspelling. And maybe we should rethink that in terms of how we get feedback.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so actually one of the things that I do in math, and I'm still continuing to do at the distant learning, is I do a graph of the week. And there's 2 graphs that the students have to, when we start at the beginning of the school year with just ideas, but now we're in a 5-paragraph essay where they analyze these graphs. And I find, like with you were talking about, the feedback is difficult because I'll read their essay, I'll type back, but they don't necessarily read it. They don't read what I write back to go back and actually go back and fix. I'll be like, oh, this is a great idea, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Or you need to improve this sentence, or, hey, you need to pull some more facts from the graph or whatever. And if they read it, I don't know. And if they did read it, they definitely don't go back. So I have found that. I didn't know if the ELA teachers have any other suggestions, because it is time consuming for me to go and respond to everybody's. And then when they don't do anything with it, I don't know if they're actually learning,
That's a great point. I know English teachers, we struggle with that lots with revision. I've tried to make a strong emphasis on almost as much on revision as the initial creation, because I think, as something of a writer myself, I find my revision, that is where it really gets decent instead of just bad, And so a lot of our kids don't have experience to go past that initial. There was a great writing book. It's called Bird by Bird. And I think it's her first chapter. She calls it Shitty First Drafts, and just talks about that concept of, hey, let's embrace that and let's focus on revision. And so, yeah, that's a great point. And I saw, Ethan, you had your hand up? Ethan, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't have my hand up. I had a thing that I was taking care of.
Okay, your hand technically is up. The icon for your hand is up.
Is it? How did I manage that? Okay, I will lower my hand. There's apparently also a button.
It's a no section.
I guess what I really wanted to say was I made a mistake, and then I figured out a part of the program that allowed me to not make the mistake again. So
nice, Ethan.
Good recovery.
Very proud moment for me.
A couple last thoughts here, but I wanted to share as far as next steps. But we would go a last one then. Cody, were you stretching, or is that a hand?
Oh, I was directing traffic over in the kitchen. So, yeah.
Oh, you also have a hand, digital hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm not calling people out like, hey.
No, that's cool. I appreciate you being thorough. No, it's down now. It's official. It's down.
Okay. Let me see. All right. So just a couple thoughts for next steps. We've been talking about this, I've been sharing it. So I think really, I know I have lots to reflect on for fourth quarter, and fourth quarter is not over, of course, but to learn as much as possible from what we've been going through, what our students have been going through, what's been working. And man, I think one of the worst things that could happen is we get back, whenever we go back to some kind of semblance of normalcy as far as face-to-face teaching, and if we just go back to business as usual, like that would just be tragic. And that's not going to happen for anybody here, of course, but for our colleagues even, so I think we need to learn ourselves as much as we can from these situations and help to bring them along also. So reflecting on the fourth quarter, and then communicating to teachers. So sorry, I was rethinking this idea. So I think we really need to make whatever it is, a document and send it or talk the old-fashioned way to teachers for the next grade level, so they know what standards weren't addressed. So I need to let 12th grade teachers know these are the standards that normally kids we can expect to come up with. They don't have these, or maybe some of them, maybe not. But I think it's a good idea to have kind of a formalized process of doing this, whether it's learning team, ideally I think department, or maybe if we're going ideal, we'd say school-wide. But to have a system in place to communicate what kids are not addressing, because again, if we go back to that number that I just kind of threw out there, 5 months for some kids without learning, that's maybe a quarter of learning loss. It's going to take years, plural, for them to catch up. And if you're an 11th grade or 12th grade teacher, then they may have some harsh realities coming post high school. Those gaps are gonna surface at some point, and which is unfortunate. So we have to just do our best to kind of mitigate those gaps. I think we should be thinking about next school year, of course, too, and grading practices and policies. Hopefully we learn from these situations. We can bring more on board, and it'll be interesting as we continue the school year and see what happens with kids as far as motivation goes and for learning. One thing that I realized I didn't mention before, but another thing, why should students continue to learn without grades? Part of my philosophy is that humans by nature want to learn, so as kids, we want to learn. At some point in school kind of takes the joy for learning out from us, but it's still there, and so that's why if kids can really get into the intrinsic motivation, see the purpose, see the importance that kids want to learn, we just have to guide them back to the love of learning that they've lost along the way. So thinking about grading policies next year, bringing more people on board. Cohort 1, that's been working throughout this year. Again, I think it's been some great work. It's unfortunately not ended the way that we wanted to, but such is life. So we want to continue a book study for next year. So if you have about grading, so if you have a suggestion for a book, let me or Mindy know about that. I have my next slide, I think, is a number of grading books. And so to kind of continue some light work with grading reform, but we're looking for a second cohort too. So if you're joining now and you're possibly interested, or somebody else, then let us know. As far as I know right now, we're going to have, or it might not, it's not set in stone, but hopefully we will have some funding. We were kind of working on that before closures, but hopefully we'll have some funding, continued funding for next year, because this year has, I think, really been great from the district, and in providing funding for for subs and books and stuff like that. So hopefully we'll continue to have that, because as we all know, creating meaningful grades is really important. And when it's kind of like the idea, I think, of lots of research says that if you pay people enough, then they don't have to worry about the money. Okay, so if you make grades meaningful and like they're there and they mean something, then students to a certain extent don't have to worry about the grades, right? They can worry about the learning. They can just trust that they're fair, they're accurate, they're bias resistant, all those kinds of things, and then they can focus more on the learning. And I think some of us, we've seen that this year in our grading reforms. Okay, so yeah, those are some of the next steps I have. And then here are a bunch of books that I suggest. I have all of them. Of course, the Grading for Equity. We have a big push next year in our district for special ed, right? And we're gonna have for that mainstreaming. So if you're thinking about grades and special ed, this is the book I would suggest for you. Lee and Jung, it's cut off. It's also with Thomas Guskey, who's really one of the top grading researchers, but she is the specialist in, as it says, the title says, grading exceptional and struggling learners. So this book by Tom Schimmer, Grading from the Inside Out, it's a great book. Standards-based grading. It's a great book. I'm currently reading this one, Grades Matter, or Making Grades Matter by Matt Townsley. I'm rereading parts of it actually right now, but it's a good book. Of course, Grading for Equity. Rick Wormeli, Fair Isn't Always Equal, is a good one, as they all are. And then this one over here on the top right by Gusky, this just came out. I just got it in the mail, haven't read it yet, but it's supposed to be pretty good. Ken O'Connor, if you didn't notice, I think he's not here anymore, but he was on for a little bit on the call. And his book, How to Grade for Learning, is a really good one. I have about 8 extra books in my classroom that if you're interested, I will give you one as soon as we get back and everything's deep cleaned and stuff like that. But that's a good one too. So that's gonna do it. It's 10:26, and wanna respect everybody's time. Thanks a lot for coming, I appreciate it. And this has been great dialogue. I'm anxious to read all the comments here. So Mindy, don't like shut down the whole chat, because I want to read through them. I think those are like gone, right?
I won't shut anything down. I think because you've recorded it, it also keeps a transcript of the chat, but I'll keep
Okay.
it. I just want to say one thing as we wrap up. I did make a comment on here, just about how we interact with each other. And I think it's important too to keep in mind that we're all operating under what we think are the best interests of our students. And I think a comment was made earlier about a teacher's assignments that they were assigning. And I just want us to be mindful that I think we're all trying to do what we think is the right thing. And I don't want people to feel shut down, because maybe that is what they see students as needing to do at that time. So I want to be open and accepting of what we discuss in this group, but also not, we don't want to attack our colleagues at this point, because I think we are all doing the best that we can right now during this time. So I just want to address that. I want to invite you to continue this conversation. It sounds like this group is really interested in continuing this work or continuing these conversations. So I know, Josh, maybe you and I afterwards can work something out if you guys are interested in this. This could be something that we do a little more routinely since we're out of school at this point. So if you are interested, email Josh and I, like he said, any suggestions or things that you can think of. This was an awesome conversation today. The comments in the chat was so much fun to read. So I really appreciate everyone's time today, and please reach out if you are interested in continuing this.
And I'll just add, thank you, Mindy, and thank you for hosting this and taking the time, Mindy, and again, everybody. And I'll just mention one more time, I know sometimes I do tend to be a little bit critical, so I hope I didn't offend anybody in some of the criticisms I have. But like I said, I've made all of those mistakes and above and beyond in the past. And so I tend to be kind of self-critical as well, but in the interest of not critical for the sake of criticism itself, but for the interest of moving forward. And so I hope I didn't offend too many people in any comments. So again, thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Love to continue the conversations, and reach out to one of us. And we'd like to continue this work, this grading work, and the grading and the learning work, right? The teaching and the learning work, because they all go together throughout the semester, the year, and then next year and above and beyond.
Thanks all.
All right, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one, guys.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you. Bye.